Okay. Let me see if, I guess this mic's working. Everybody can hear me okay? Okay. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about beef heifer and pasture responses to fall forage allocations. And I tend to talk fast, so if you have questions or you need me to slow down, just raise your hand and stop me at any time. So here's an outline for the presentation. First, I'm going to talk about some recent research in heifer development, discuss the advantages and challenges of extended season grazing. Then I'll go into specific detail about the research that I've been working on for the past 3 years, looking at the objectives of the research, and then the results in terms of pasture responses and animal gain, and heifer reproductive performance. Reproduction is the single most important factor in profitable beef production. For beef heifer replacements to be successful, they need to demonstrate effective reproductive performance without excessive development costs. So there's a number of factors to consider for effective management of reproductive development of heifers. Those are genetic selection and heterosis, health, level of nutrition for the heifers, and gains prior to puberty. So there have been many studies in many species that have demonstrated that diet during development can partially control physiological changes that are necessary for puberty. Research from the 1960s through the late 1980s demonstrated greater negative effects of limited post-weaning growth on age of puberty and pregnancy rates, whereas more recent research has shown less of a negative impact of delayed puberty on pregnancy. So the research that was conducted through the 1960s through the early 1980s indicated that puberty occurred at a genetically predetermined size, and only when heifers reach a target weight can pregnancy rates be obtained. So from that research, guidelines were established that indicated replacement heifers should reach 60 to 65% of their expected mature body weight by breeding. So from that research and from those guidelines that were developed, traditional approaches for post-weaning development of replacement heifers primarily focus on feeding heifers to achieve or exceed that target weight, and then thereby maximize pregnancy rates. But since then, there's been substantial changes in cattle genetics and economy, which indicate that these traditional systems may need to be reevaluated. Intensive heifer development systems may maximize pregnancy rates, but not necessarily optimize profit or sustainability. So what are some considerations for today? I don't know what happened. Okay. So what are some considerations today for developing replacement heifers? First of all, we've seen a reduction in the supply of relatively inexpensive feeds that have traditionally been used for developing heifers. Also, we've seen a negative impact of increases in costs of feed, and we've traditionally relied heavily on harvested feed. So research during the last decade has attempted to address these considerations by comparing traditional heifer development systems with alternative systems that use less feed and rely on compensatory gain. So next I'm going to go over a couple of different studies that have been done here recently looking at heifer development systems. A study done in Nebraska compared the long-term reproductive performance of two groups of crossbred heifers developed to 53%, which they termed low gain, and 58%, which they termed high gain of mature body weight. So if you remember when I talked about that target body weight that was developed, it was at 60 to 65%. So they're looking at developing these heifers at lower body weight at breeding, 53 versus 58%. Both of the groups were developed on identical rations, which included hay, wheat middlings, corn, and supplement. So the only difference in the two rations was in the corn that reflected the increased gain for the high gain heifers. So here are the results of that study. The beginning weight of the heifers for the low gain and high gain groups were the same, 469 pounds. The gain during the winter for the high group was 1.4, for the low group was 1.1. Their pre-breeding weights were 636 for low and 689 for high. The pregnancy rate was 92% for the low group and 88% for the high group.
Explain what you mean by low and high before I understand.
Okay, that goes back to this slide. So what they called the low group was the heifers that were developed to an expected 53% of mature body weight at breeding, and the high group were developed to be 58% of mature body weight at breeding. And they had the same diet except for a difference in corn for those two groups. Oops. So as you can see, there was actually a higher pregnancy rate for the group that was developed at that lower pre-breeding body weight. And then they also looked at the pre-calving body weight for those heifers, 913 versus 937, so it was a little lower for that low group. The body condition at first calving was relatively the same. Body condition at weaning was a little bit lower for the low group. They looked at pregnancy rate with the second calf. It was equal, 91% of those heifers got pregnant. They also looked at second calvers. So pregnant with the third calf, the low group was a little bit higher at 94% versus 92%. And then pregnant with the fourth calf, the two groups were equal at 96% being pregnant. So another study conducted with 270 heifers that had a body weight at weaning of 496 pounds compared these heifers grazing either winter range or corn residue. Both of these groups, the winter range group and the corn residue group, were given a 31% crude protein supplement 3 times per week at 1 pound per head per day, and then also 4 pounds per head per day of hay. So they basically had the same supplement, but one group was grazing winter range and one group was grazing corn residue. Oh, sorry, this is touchy. So the results of that study, their pre-breeding body weight for the winter range group was 657, and for the heifers grazing the corn residue was 622 pounds. And they calculated that the winter range group was at 55% of mature weight at breeding, and the corn residue group was at 52% of mature weight at breeding. So lower pre-breeding body weights for the corn residue group versus the winter range group. If you look at their average daily gain during the winter range group of heifers gained more than the corn residue group. The pre-breeding average daily gain was 0.84 and 0.64. So I want to note that with the corn residue group, they were put out on winter range at 100 days prior to breeding. So they had the corn residue first, and then they went on winter range at 100 days prior to breeding. And this group was continually on winter range. The summer average daily gain was 1.48 for winter range and 1.59 for the corn residue group, which indicates that they compensated a little bit in the summer for that earlier restriction during the winter. The percent pubertal before breeding was 67% for the winter range group and 50% for the corn residue group. And then the percent that got pregnant was 84% for winter range and corn residue group was 82%, so not a difference there in pregnancy percentage. So now I'm going to go into the specifics of the study that I've worked on for the past 3 years. So as we know, in Appalachia, grasslands is an extensive natural resource. Our biggest challenge is trying to meet the nutritional needs of grazing cattle throughout their entire developmental period, 12 months a year, with minimal or no dependence upon stored feed or supplements. If we can reduce the use and dependence on conserved forages, then we can reduce the cost of developing replacement heifers. So one way that we can do this is by extending the grazing season. And what are benefits of extending the grazing season? We can reduce the cost of making or purchasing mechanically harvested forage. Sometimes our topography limits mechanical forage harvesting and manure application. And there are also opportunities for more uniform and cost-effective distribution of nutrients from manure and urine by grazing animals than from mechanical application. Let me make sure I didn't. So when we talk about extending the grazing season, we always want to talk about stockpiling. Stockpiling is the accumulation of forage for grazing during dormant season to reduce the cost of winter feeding. We want to stockpile summer regrowth, and stockpiling cool season species for winter is during the period of moderate to low growth rate, which is basically mid to late summer. Oh, gosh, I'm sorry. This is really touchy. Okay. So when you talk about stockpiling, you want to try to allocate enough land area and time to grow about 2,000 to 4,000 pounds of dry matter per acre during August and September. Apply nitrogen early in the stockpiling period for grass response, and you want to fence to utilize that pasture for 3 to 7 days to minimize wasting of the forage. Okay, so the specific objectives of my project was to evaluate the seasonal dynamics of forage mass, forage quality, and botanical composition in response to our fall forage allocations, and also to compare heifer growth and reproductive performance following 2 patterns of gain during the fall. So this study started in August of 2009 and it ran through August of 2012. It was conducted at the WVU Agricultural and Forestry Experiment Station at the Reedsville Farm in Preston County, which is in northern West Virginia. Our soil types were basically silt loams with rain, earnest, and gilpin being most predominant. The pH of the pastures was 5.5 to 6.7 on average. The pastures contained cool season grass species with orchard grass, tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, timothy, a little smooth brome, red clover, white clover, and then broadleaved weeds. Gosh, I'm sorry. You have to touch it very lightly. So our stockpiling began in mid to late August. We applied urea at 70 to 90 pounds per acre, depending on the legume density of the pasture, and the pastures were allowed to regrow until November. So here, this just shows how we set up our grazing treatment design. Basically, we had 3 pastures that were approximately 12 acres in size. And we took each of those pastures and we split it to where we had 8 acres on one half and 4 acres on the other half. And for each of our years, we had 10 to 12 heifers in the 8 acres and 10 to 12 heifers in the 4 acres. And then that was replicated 3 times because we had 3 fields. So the first year we had 72 heifers total, the second year we had 64, and the third year we had 67. So our grazing treatments were a high herbage allowance versus a low herbage allowance. So what does that mean? Basically, for the low treatment, that meant the heifers received a daily herbage dry matter allowance of 3.5% of their body weight. So for example, if we had 10 heifers at 533 pounds, and we wanted to give them 4 days worth of grazing at 3.5% of their body weight, then we would allocate them 746 pounds of dry matter total for all 10 heifers for 4 days. The high treatment was a daily herbage dry matter allowance of 7% of their body weight. So again, if you have the same 10 heifers at 533 pounds for 4 days of grazing, they would have been allotted 1,492 pounds for that whole 4 days. So basically double what the low treatment received. Our herbage allowances were delineated by using portable electric fencing for the paddocks. So here you can see this is where they were grazing, and they would be moving into that next paddock. So each treatment group was given a new paddock every 3 to 5 days in a strip grazing pattern without back fencing so that the cattle could return to water and minerals. So here you can see this is where they had been grazing. They were just moved into this paddock, and they were allowed to go back here because this is where our water was at. We continued our grazing treatments until there was too much snow for grazing, or until they had completely grazed the pastures. And for that first year, they only grazed till about December 22nd, because if you remember the winter of 09, 2010, we got a lot of snow, so we didn't get to graze the entire pasture that year. Yes?
What have you found is the limit of snow, what amount of snow starts limiting their ability to get enough feed?
Well, actually, it's not so much the amount of snow, it's when it gets icy and crusty and they can't get through that layer. If it's powdery, dusty snow, I mean, they can get right through it. But when it starts icing over and getting crusty, then they can't get to the grass. The second year we grazed for about 58 days through about the first part of January, and the third year we grazed about 68 days later on into January. So the third year we had our longest grazing during the fall. So after that fall grazing was over with, we went into our winter feeding period where the heifers received 12.4 pounds per head per day of haylage and 3.4 pounds per head per day of soy hulls. After winter was over, we went into what we termed the spring grazing period, and that's when, in about mid to late March, the fences between the high and low herbage allowances came down, so the pastures were continuously stocked through May. And after May, which is when we bred the heifers, all of them were combined into one group, and then throughout the summer they were rotated among all of the pastures until early August. So here's our breeding protocol. The heifers were synchronized in May using a 7-day cedar insert, with prostaglandin injection on day 6 and an estradiol injection 40 hours after cedar removal. The heifers were then artificially inseminated using a single sire, and about 2 weeks after that, a cleanup bull was put in for about 36 days. So of course, there's always going to be things that are out of your control and when you're doing a research project, and the weather is certainly one of those. So I just want to touch on a few things about the climate data over those 3 years of the study. So what I have highlighted in yellow here, basically this is year 1, showing the snow that we received. This is our 30-year mean, this top line here. So you can see here in December, it's 324 millimeters, January 1,021, February 436. So year 1, this shows our departure from normal. So basically that year we had 324 millimeters more than the average snow, than the average 30-year mean, 122 more in January, and 2,155 more in February. Our year 2, it was a really dry fall. We had less rain than the 30-year normal July, August, and September, which you'll see in a little bit affected the amount of dry matter that we were able to stockpile in year 2. And then in year 3, we had a really wet fall. We were above normal in rain for August, September, October, November, and December. So this table shows the herbage mass, stocking rate, stocking density, and grazing days just during the fall period. So when I was talking about the weather earlier, as you can see here in year 2, we were only able to stockpile 2,626 pounds of dry matter per acre. It was a really dry year. Year 1, we had 3,468. Year 3, 3,630. So you can see our stocking rate for each of the years and each of the treatments, low versus high, 2.6, 1.4. Year 2 was 2.3 for the low and 1.2 for the high, 2.4 and 1.3. Here are our stocking densities in terms of pounds per acre. And then our grazing days. So as I mentioned before, the first year we were cut short due to the weather. We only grazed for 35 days, and that should be 35 too, that's a typo. Year 2, a little bit longer, 58 days, and then year 3, we grazed for almost 70 days.
And when you say this is your winter grazing, right?
This is beginning in November when the heifers went on pasture, and then until either the snow stopped us or we grazed the entire pasture. Yeah. So had we had more pasture, I think in year 2 and year 3, we would have been able to graze longer. But we just ran out in the fields that we were in. They had grazed the whole pasture. Yes.
Do you reseed those pastures in the summer or spring?
No, I didn't mention that. When we started this project in 2009, we didn't do any pasture renovation whatsoever. The only thing we did was apply nitrogen in the fall for stockpiling. There was no reseeding, nothing for these pastures. It was just native cool season grasses, whatever was out there.
What height is the optimum stockpile?
Well, you want to get to about 2,000 to 4,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. I mean, that's really what you want to shoot for. So think of it in terms of that instead of in terms of height. It's more mass instead of height, because height can be tricky. You can have a tall height but not have a lot of mass there.
Yeah, I mean, if you got a bunch of poverty grass or something, you don't want to measure them stems, but
yeah.
Kind of your mean level, where whatever that should be. I'm sure there's
That was my question.
Yeah, well, and it depends on the species that are out there also. I mean, you really just need to look at that and look at your overall mass instead of looking at it in terms of height.
Is the maturity level of that mass of concern? Because, is it a seed? Is it nutritionally, the age of the plant still a concern?
Well, when you're stockpiling, you're stockpiling regrowth. So some are regrowth. So it's really going to start regrowing, end of August, September, October. And here in a minute, I'm going to show you the nutritional composition of what we found. So this table shows the change of our dry matter in terms of pound per acre for the fall grazing period. And it's split up between year 1, year 2, and year 3. And these are the dates that the dry matter was measured. So November, December, and then we went into January in year 2 and 3. So November 16th, we had about 3,000 pounds of dry matter per acre in November. A little less than that as the month went on, and then in December we were at 28.95 for the low, 29.37 for the high. So in year 2, if you remember, I said it was a dry year. We started out with less to begin with. So November 27th of that year, we had only about 2,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. And in January, we were down to 1,800. Year 3 was sort of similar to year 1. The end of November, we had about 2,800. And then the beginning of January, we were down to about 2,200. And that's just, this was measured in the paddocks where the heifers had not been in yet, so they hadn't been grazing this. This is just due to senescence of the plants. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, and this shows the dry matter for the spring through summer grazing period. So when you're looking at the amounts for these different months, you have to keep in mind that this is just an average for the month. Because during the summer, June, July, and August, we were rotating through 3 different pastures. So at times, you know, if they had just come off of a pasture, the dry matter in that field would have been lower, but if they were just going in, it would have been higher. So these are just averages. And I just put this table up here to let you know this is what we found over the 3 years. This is, you know, what you could come to expect in April, May, June, July, and August for the type of pastures that we had.
Is there a fertilizer application in between any of that?
We didn't do any fertilizer application, any reseeding. Right, except for August when we put the nitrogen on for stockpiling. So in April and May, you know, we didn't really have a lot, but then the forage starts growing. You know, you get a lot more in June, July, and then it declines a little bit in August. But you have to remember too, in April and May, those heifers were still on that same paddock that they had been on all winter. So it was continuously grazed in April and May, and it still did a really good job regrowing because we used those same pastures when we rotated through June, July, and August.
Are they fed any mineral mixes?
They were given just free choice trace mineral mix out there. So we basically ran, you know, up to 72 heifers on 36 acres, November through August. So now I want to talk a little bit about the botanical composition of the pastures. Orchard grass predominated in all 3 years at 32, 25, and 20%. We had a little bit of quackgrass, tall fescue, and timothy. And this was in the pasture where we had the low heifers. And then on the high treatment side, again, orchard grass dominated with a little bit of smooth brome. And then after year 1, we didn't really see it. We saw more tall fescue at 17 and 14% of the pasture, some quackgrass, Kentucky bluegrass at 8% and 5%. So one thing we did notice is we started out with quite a bit of quackgrass in year 1, but the more we grazed, it tended to disappear. So now I want to look at the difference between the percent grass and percent legume in these different fields. In year 1, we started out with about almost 75% grass, 7% legume, and then 8.6% non-legume forbs. In year 2, grass declined to 63%, legume went up to 19%. Year 3, the grass percent was at like 42, and the legume percentage has shot up to 36. And this was on the side where we had, you know, the low heifers where it was grazed more intensively. The side of the field where we had the high treatment, we saw the same general decline for the grass. It went from 66 to 49%. Legume, 6%, all the way up to 26% legume. And the broadleaved weeds, non-legume forbs, 28.6, 25%. So those stayed pretty much the same over the treatments. So going back to the clover in the fields, we had white clover and red clover. When we started out in year 1, we only had about 1% white clover, 6% red clover. By the time we got to year 3, we were up to 22% white clover and 14% red clover. Same general trend with the pasture that contained the high group treatment, 0.9 up to 16.4 for white clover, red clover 4.6 up to 9.8. So by the time we got to year 3 and we're stockpiling, we were stockpiling a lot of clover that generally doesn't stockpile all that well. So you can,
What caused that to happen?
just the grazing, just we, you know, especially when you can see in the low treatment, you know, it was more intensively grazed, and so we saw more clover coming from that intensive grazing management.
Don't you think manure and urine affected that?
Yeah, that would have some effect too.
How are those fields managed before you started your research?
Just hay, just generally hay, and a little bit of pasture. Hay and pasture. Oh, jeez. Oh. Okay, so this graph basically shows you exactly what I was just talking about before, but it's more of a graphic representation of that. The yellow and the blue indicate the grass, so you can see that decline over the years, year 1 through 3. And then the red and the purple indicate the legume percentage, so you can see how that increased over the years.
Did you take soil samples in each of those 3 years to,
Yes.
any change by year 3?
Really not a lot of change. I mean, the pH changed ever so slightly, but not enough that you could say, you know, we really saw a change in the soil characteristics. So I just wanted to show you these pictures talking about the clover percentage that we had in year 3. And we had one pasture, which we called field 1, which had the most clover out of all 3 of the pastures. And this is a picture of it. So this is what it looked like in the fall, and this would have been a paddock that the heifers would be going into. So you can see lots of clover in there, and this is what it looked like while they were grazing it. And also remember too, that was the year it was really, really wet. So we had a lot of just trampling of the forage that year.
When you finally started to feed the heifers and they weren't grazing, did you feed in the same lot or did you move the hay around?
No, during the winter they were fed in that same pasture.
Was that the pasture that had the clover?
Yeah, I mean, so
The seed of the hay from?
yeah, the heifers stayed in the same pasture all the way through, from November through August. I mean, you know, we didn't utilize any other pastures except those 3. So, and the hay, the haylage that was fed to them was made on the same farm. You know, obviously.
Was it dumped in the same spot all the time?
No, it was spread out. It was spread out through the, spread out through the fields. Oh. So this is what we called field 2. It had less clover than field 1, and this is that same year. So this is what field 2 looked like before grazing, and that's what it would look like during grazing. So you can see the difference between the 2. There's just a huge amount of clover in that one field, field 1. This table has a lot of information on it, but it's basically just showing the nutritional composition of the forage throughout the fall period. So looking up at the first line, that's the crude protein. So starting out in year 1, about 16, 17%. It was down to about 14, 15% by the time we got to mid-December. Year 2, we were up around 18, 20. Year 3, it ranged from about 16 to 20%.
What caused the quality to go up over time? The grazing program?
You mean going from about 16 to 19 to 20 over here in year 3?
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of it probably had to do with, you know, we had more clover in those fields, which would probably have added to the crude protein percentage. TDN, we were at 63 to 65, up to about 70 in year 2, but pretty much in that same range for all 3 years. Okay, this shows the same thing, the nutritional composition, but it's looking at the forage for the spring, summer, the haylage, and the soy hulls. So during the spring, we were at about 23, 24, 25% crude protein. In the summer, it stayed at about 19 or 20%. The haylage was 13% in year 1 and about 11% in year 2 and 3. The soy hulls were at 15% year 1 and 2 and about 11.5% in year 3. Looking at the TDN, for the soy hulls, this is a book value because I don't have the forage analysis back up for energy on the soy hull, so that's a book value there. These were actually analyzed in the lab and measured. So in the spring, we were running about 65 to 71% TDN, 62 to 66 for summer, and then the haylage was at about 56 to 58% TDN. I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but I just wanted to show you what the average daily gains looked like for each of the years. So as you can see, it wasn't a steady decline or a steady increase. I mean, for all 3 years, I mean, gains were just up and down for the 3-4 different periods. Okay, so now we get into, okay, we've talked about, how we did this, what the conditions were. So what did these heifers actually do in terms of growth and reproductive performance? When we started out with the heifers in November and put them on treatment, here were their initial body weights. Pretty much the same, ranging from 533 in year 3, 546, 547 pounds in year 2, 543 and 545 pounds in year 1. And here are the average daily gains for the fall period. In year 1, the high group gained 1.4 pounds per head per day. And the low group was at 0.82 pounds. Year 2, we had lower gains at 0.6 and negative 0.11. They actually lost weight. In year 3, we were back up to 0.68 and 0.15 for the fall. During the winter, it was pretty much the same for the high and low in year 1, 0.86, 0.75. Year 2, the high group was at 0.73 and about half a pound a gain for the low group in year 2. Year 3, the high group was at 1.04 and at 0.71 for the low. For the spring average daily gain, you can see that in each of the 3 years, the low group outgained the high group. 3.15 versus 3, 3.86 versus 3.51, 2.21 versus 2.18. The summer, again, except for in year 1, the low group outgained the high group. 1.76 and 1.72 for year 1. Year 2, 1.26, 1.19. Year 3, 1.52 and 1.76. So throughout the spring and the summer, the low group seemed to compensate a little bit for that earlier restriction. They outgained the high group, but they never quite caught up to the high group in terms of total body weight. And I'm going to show you those numbers in a minute. So these are the numbers that just show their average daily gain from November through May, through breeding. And this shows their average daily gain from weaning to preg check, which is basically November through when they were pregnancy checked in August. So for both of those periods, it was, 1.2, 1.5 pounds per day on average. So this just shows a good graphic description of what we were just talking about. You have the low here in the lighter blue and the high groups in the darker blue. So in all cases, the high group, you know, gained more than the low, except for spring and summer, where the low group really outgained those high group heifers. Okay, so now we're going to look at the reproductive responses. Here, this first line shows their body weight at breeding. The high group was at 814 pounds and the low group was at 787 pounds. In year 2, 781 and 734, and in year 3 we had the lowest body weights at breeding, 756 versus 692 for the low group. So remember I said that the low group's average daily gain was higher for spring and summer than the high groups, but they still never did catch up to the high group in terms of total body weight. Here are their weights at pregnancy determination, which was done at the first part of August. So still a difference there between the two groups. Not a lot, but still a little bit of difference. This line shows the percent that had reached puberty prior to breeding. The first year, it was dead even at 60% for both groups. Year 2, 28% for the high group, 25% for the low. Year 3 was much lower, 18% for the high group and 20% for the low group. So next, we have the percent pregnant by AI. It was pretty much the same again in year 1, 39 versus 40%. Year 2, we had more of the heifers in the high group get pregnant off of AI, 34% versus 19% for the low. Year 3, even though they were lower weights at breeding, we had a better percent pregnancy rate than we had the first 2 years at 61 versus 41%. Percent pregnant by the bull, you can see these numbers here, 42, 34, 34 versus 50, and 21 versus 38. So looking at the overall pregnancy rates, we had 81 versus 74, 68, 69, so it's pretty much the same in year 2. A little bit higher for the high group in year 3, but not by much, 82 versus 79%. So that table was looking at each of the 3 years separately. So when you look at this project and combine all 3 years' data, this is what it shows. Total pregnancy rate for the low group was 73, and total pregnancy rate for the high group was 77. So not a huge difference there. Looking at their body weight at breeding, not a lot of difference there either. About 46 pounds, 738 versus 784 pounds. This line up here shows the days that they were on each of these treatments. The fall on average was 54 days. The winter feeding on average was 101 days. Spring 38, and they grazed throughout the summer for about 75 days. So total time on treatment was 268 days. And then you can see the average daily gains here. And again, this is all 3 years combined. And then I just went ahead and just, you know, because I wanted to sort of see what were the total gains on average for each of the periods for the heifers. So in the fall for the low group, total as a group, they only gained about 7 pounds. For the high group, it was about 39. Winter was 70 and 92. Spring was 120 and 113. Summer was 148 and 130. So for a total gain per head on average of 345 pounds for the low and 374 pounds for the high. So that's November through August. The percent that reached puberty was pretty much the same at 32 and 34%. And if you look down here, so the heifers started out at pretty much the same body weight. By the end of the fall grazing, the high group was 30 pounds heavier than the low group. By the end of the winter feeding period, the high group was 52 pounds heavier than the low group. So the low group was still losing. By the end of the spring period, the low group had come back a little bit, and there was only 46 pounds difference between the two groups. And by the end of the summer period, they had shortened that to 28 pounds between the two groups. So pretty much the difference that we started with by the end of the fall grazing with the two different groups is pretty much what we ended up with at the end during pregnancy check, 30 versus 28 pounds difference between the two. So just if you're wondering, this is an example for year 3 when we had 67 head on treatment. We didn't keep all of the heifers as replacements. So what happened to those replacements, and what were those non-replacements rather worth? We kept 32 of the heifers out of 67. So 35 of those were sold to a feedlot. The average weight in August when they were sold was 926 pounds. You can see the price per hundredweight there. And 7 of them graded choice, 21 of them graded low choice, and 6 graded select plus. So you can do the math in your head. You know, sold 35. There was their average weight and the price. So that's pretty much what the ones were worth that we did not keep. And we haven't done any economic analysis to see, you know, with this system, did we save any money? I mean, that's something that we really need to do. But, you know, we grazed pretty much the whole time except for the time that we fed haylage and a little bit of soy hulls. So I definitely think that's something that we should look at, but we just haven't. So what were our conclusions and what are some future research in this field? Delaying the majority of weight gain until late in heifer development may decrease the cost of winter feeding without detrimental effects on reproductive performance. Now I know our pregnancy rates weren't as high as you'd like to see, but there still wasn't a huge difference between the two groups. So currently, I think more research is needed on systems that utilize dormant forages because there's not a whole lot out there. Systems and their impacts of heifer development on cow longevity. And then what are the effects of these systems on the offspring of those heifers developed within those systems? So are there any questions? Yes?
All right, Bobbi, let's have a seminar.
Oh, no.
Did you take individual weights on these heifers, or are these heifers divided groups, weight as
Individual weights. We took individual weights on all the heifers.
And did you go back and mine the data and look at pregnant females versus the open females?
That's-
Ratio terms relative to their difference in gains in both groups.
That's what I'm in the process of doing, looking at
Right.
individuals.
Okay. Was the genetic composition of the heifers uniform across all 3 years?
Pretty much. They came from, some came from the Reedsville farm, some came from the WVU Wardensville farm. They were all crossbred heifers. There was one year when we did need a few more, so we had like 2 or 3 purebred heifers in there. I think that was year 2. But pretty much across the board, you know, they all come from the same herd.
And in year 3, would there have been daughters in that group that came out of heifers in year 1 that could have had some selection pressure put on them under the system that you managed?
No, not in year 3. No.
So I observed in the data that in year 3, you had relatively better conception rates.
Yes.
Despite relatively lower gains.
Yes, we did.
And whether that was improved management or better AI technique or lots of other variables that could be in there, I'm not
Yeah.
sure, but there was a defined difference.
There was, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Any more questions? Yes, ma'am?
Birth weight of the calves, the average of the birth weight.
Ooh. You know, I have all that data, but I've never calculated an average. I'm going to say 70 pounds. And that's from memory, so.
Second calf heifers seem to be harder to get bred back with bull. I know feed and everything has a lot to do with that, but it seems like I have trouble. getting bred back the second time, you know, after the first calf.
Yeah, and I know I hear a lot of people say that, and there are some studies now looking at, you know, if these heifers are developed in this type of system, what do they do in terms of their, you know, second breeding? Do you have anything? I mean, this guy back here does a lot of this, so maybe he can help you out.
You know, I think what a lot of the emerging thought process is if you look at the total amount of nutrition that we're going to put into the cow over her lifetime, that we probably benefit in some systems, and I've got the whole presentation on this that I may use tomorrow, by focusing more on nutritional supplementation after her first calving and after her second calving, and actually less nutritional supplementation pre-pubescent heifer breeding, to use that period of not nutritional deprivation, but less additional nutrition to help them self-select out before you get to that open heifer or open 2 or 3. And that's really sort of what Bobbi's showing here, is that maybe we shouldn't get hung up on the open heifers in that first year. They may be the most valuable animals in our selection process. Because what I think her early part of her presentation was demonstrating is that from the 60s to the 80s, the thought process was we wanted to almost overdevelop it, with the goal being to get every single one of them pregnant. But if every single one of them gets pregnant and 30% of them are open after the first calving, we've got a very expensive open too. And so that's really what I think Bobbi's trying to demonstrate, is maybe we should find those potential open ones earlier in the stage of life where we have an alternative, which is to go ahead and finish them and get some salvage value that's higher value. So agriculture.
Yeah. And these heifers, you know, they got pregnant, and you know they weren't pushed, you know, so they're already adapted to that environment that you put them in. You know, not being pushed, not having feed in front of them all the time. So, I mean, we really wanted to look at, you know, we have a great grass-based resource in this area, and how can we use that to develop these heifers with feed costs being, you know, so expensive. And we've got to look at a way that we can develop these heifers and have good performance out of them without, you know, constantly putting money out for supplements and harvested feed. You know, we have great grass. You know, some of the studies I looked at that were done out in Nebraska when we were talking about winter range, their, you know, crude protein percent is 5% in their forage. Well, you know, we have 16, 18, 19% crude protein in our fall forage. We have great grass, and we really need to use it to our advantage to develop our cattle.
Is there any limitation going past, like just if you had the grass just to pasture straight through March, you know, is there a problem with that?
Grazing straight through March?
Yeah, like in other words, you don't have a break. If you had enough stockpiled grass, just keep working them right through.
No, I mean, you want to definitely graze as long as you possibly can. I mean, if you have if the weather isn't limiting you and you have the forage, then go for it.
I'd be interested in seeing if there was a study as to, you know, how many head can I give up if I can just, if my grazing system comes all the way around the whole year.
Right.
You know, maybe, you know, for whatever those costs are.
Mm-hmm. You mean how many do you have to maybe reduce your numbers a little bit to graze all the way through?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
How many can I reduce and take advantage of that? You know.
Yeah, I would really like to have seen us be able to graze longer. I mean, I think if we had the land area to do that, you know, I would definitely like to have grazed longer, because, like I say, in year 2 and 3 we certainly could have. We just ran out of pasture. So.
Bobbi, when you were looking at your forages, and I don't know, you're getting pretty well complete utilization of where, since the percentage of orchard grass was as high as it was,
Mm-hmm.
and the makeup of the forage, did you see much of it just kind of melting away once you got into late December, January, or were they getting it all eaten before you got?
A little, but pretty much they were utilizing all of the forage that was there. Now, year 3 was a different issue because it was just so wet. I mean, even when I was walking around out there, I was trampling it and sliding, and so I think year 3 utilization was pretty low.
Are there any more questions, Steve? The extensive grazing, you think that caused that clover? What do you think brought that clover? Clover rate was some way up,
Yeah.
and you didn't reseed, you didn't have a line, you didn't.
Yeah. Something's back there.
So what you're saying is extensive grazing will bring the clover in?
Yeah, because we really intensively grazed those pastures, and so when you do that, you're opening up the canopy, and that's allowing that clover to come in. You know, when your grasses are shading out your clover, it doesn't have a chance to thrive. But when you open up that canopy, you know, it's going to come on.
Don't you lose that clover when it gets hit with frost?
Well, yeah, that's what I was talking about. When we got to having all that clover in year 3, I mean, you saw the pictures. It's not good for stockpiling. It does decline quite a bit. Yeah.
Would this actually be a better program for a fall calving program? In that your cattle, your heifers would gain through the summer and things? Their stress period would be November, December, the first trimester?
You mean to use this system
Yes.
for cows that have calved in the
Fall
fall? Or
So that your heifers would be a year and a half, or if you're breeding 15 months old. Like in November, they would be breeding.
oh, okay.
And
So
then you would be having their first trimester would be out on the stockpile where they have more limited feed. So would it maybe work better with them than even the spring calves?
I mean, I think it would work for them, but I think it works well with the spring calvers too, because again, we're seeing who can adapt and using it as a selection tool in terms of which heifers are getting pregnant under, you know, these conditions, you know, that they haven't been pushed really hard. So I mean, I still think it's a good system for those spring calves.
Statistics, though, really for the second and third calf would be important, though, because you might be successful getting that bred in the first year, but what did it do to your herd from the longevity perspective, and what kind of milk did that heifer produce? Were they low producing?
Yeah, and then that first study I talked about, they did carry that through for those heifers having second calf, third calf, fourth calf, and they really didn't see any disadvantage for the heifers that were raised to be at a lower mature body weight, estimated mature body weight. But
weaning weights of the calves they produce too would be an interesting statistic.
yeah, and there are studies out there like that, and actually I have that information on the study I presented. I just didn't include it. But if you're interested, come talk to me. I can set you up with something to look at.
People, the time is up, and we don't want them other people eating their lunch, so.